All right, everybody, let's get started. Welcome to MindGrub's pre-RSA Cyber webinar for the start of second quarter here. We're really excited for the RSA conference, and we've got a number of activities lined up while we're there. We are hosting a luncheon at the Giant Stadium. We have a few breakfasts that we've partnered with Department of Commerce on. So there's quite a few things that we're attending, and we're really interested in hearing from you as well. Well, let's start with some introductions. So I'm Todd Marks. I'm the CEO of MindGrub. I started MindGrub now 20 years ago in my basement. We make and market software, and we encounter a lot of security issues, whether it's mobile apps or web apps or Internet of Things apps that we make. We constantly have to bake in security features, as well as helping our clients out with their security. So what we're here to talk about today is that product design. We're talking about the 5 critical components of product design that cyber companies should embrace. And we're going to get into the pain points for cyber companies in product design, the solutions, and we're going to talk about some case studies throughout. We first want to hear from you, though, and see how many of you are going to be at the RSA conference. So we know the numbers in the panel right now, or I'm sorry, we know the number of attendees. If you could just let us know if you're going to the RSA conference, then we know how specific to security we can be versus being a little bit more broad and sharing some examples that are not cyber specific. All right, thank you. And Kim, what's the percent of attendees that are going to be at RSA?
I'm sharing the results.
Perfect.
Right.
All right, 50-50. That's
That's
what we were thinking. That's perfect. All right, great. Hopefully we'll get to see those the 10 of you that are attending RSA. It'd be great to meet you. All right, so just a couple quick introductions. As I mentioned, we make and market software. We happen to be located in Baltimore, Maryland as our headquarters, so we're really close to Fort Meade and NSA, and therefore one of the top industries that we work in is cyber, and we're happy to share a lot of the experiences that we've had making and marketing software for that industry. Let me first introduce our esteemed panelists. I'm joined by 2 colleagues. We have Brian Thompson. He's our Assistant Vice President of Engineering, and Brian will give his perspective from a user of security software. We also happen to have a site license, and Brian is actively taking over being our security officer, which is super exciting there too. So we're starting to do some things on the high side. We also are joined by our SVP of Strategy and Design, Ben Slavin. He is going to discuss some important things to consider from a UX and design perspective. And last but not least, I want to thank Kim Paradise. Kim is the Engagement Director for our Cybersecurity vertical. She'll be out at RSA. She's probably reached out to every one of you a couple of times and has encouraged you to meet us, and hopefully you can join us for our luncheon at Giant Stadium as well. As we go through this panel today, if you have any questions or comments, please put them in the chat. Kim's going to be monitoring that chat. I'm also going to be monitoring it. And we're going to try to weave in some of the answers to the questions as we're presenting today. But otherwise, we're going to reserve about 15 minutes at the end if there is any additional questions. So we're going to largely discuss for about 45 with a 15-minute Q&A at the end. All right. So without further ado, Brian, Ben, we know there's an issue in cybersecurity, not itself, an issue in creating software for cybersecurity. So Brian, as a cybersecurity professional, I know you work with a lot of different software products. Why would you say that there's a challenge with the user experience of those software products?
Yeah, great question. You know, Todd, as we look at the cybersecurity industry and what I am responsible for in protecting both MindGrub and all of our clients, we've got a number of different tools and pieces of software out there, but inherently we're an industry that is tough to find talent in. You and I know we've gone back and forth quite a bit about how difficult it is to find talented people who can respond. And so because of that, we spend a lot of time training our new people and bringing them up to speed. And because of that, the interface that our teams work with and that cybersecurity software has to fill needs to appeal to a really wide audience. You've got those who have been doing it for a while who need the nitty gritty, But you also have to deal with those people who need to get things done quickly, and it's easy for them to pick up if they're not familiar with that software. Generally, cybersecurity software is very utilitarian. And it's not just cyber, it's across the board in many cases, but cybersecurity is one of those industries where the attackers never stop. And in some cases, if we get it wrong, there are lives or people's livelihood on the line.
I also think it's got to have something to do with the composition of talent too, right? Like most of the people that I know who geek out about cyber, they're the engineers, right? But, you know, speaking to Ben's kind of creative team, user experience and design professionals, they want to design the next Nike shoe these days, right? So do you think there's also maybe a little bit of a shortage of user experience professionals in that industry?
Most definitely. You know, cybersecurity departments are normally not just understaffed, but also under budgeted. And so therefore they're trying to bring people on who are focused on the more technical side of things and less on the user experience side. We're a department that lives in the background that if we do our job well, the customers of Nike have no idea that there's a cybersecurity department there keeping them safe on the back end.
That's funny. So they don't just sell shoes, they also have to worry about cybersecurity. That makes a lot of sense. I remember I was walking out of a Westin one day and I didn't even realize, but Westin, which is now a Marriott property, it was Starwood at the time. I had reporters just accost me as I walked out of the building, and I had no idea what was going on. But I gave an interview, and you know, Starwood had their credit cards hacked, and they pulled a bunch of credit card numbers, as well as some personal identifiable information. So, you know, truly, cyber is across the board. Now, in this case, a lot of cyber is databases. It is, you know, hacking firewalls, right? It's endpoint detection, endpoint intrusion, and it isn't so visual. As soon as there's a software interface, Brian, you had mentioned that there's a lot of engineers at play. They're just trying to work fast and try to get the, you know, quickest to market interface that pulls the data, because they're very used to looking at data, right? This comes down to logs of firewalls, that they're just looking at data. But what we've experienced is that speed in which you can act on the data absolutely needs solid interface design. So Ben, when it comes to interface design, right, we talked about the 5 biggest things to consider. You know, why is it so important? Why is UX, particularly in cyber, so important?
Yeah, so thanks, Todd. I think, you know, first, I want to start with just the foundational concept that, you know, design is about more than just how something looks. It's about how it works. And so when people talk about user experience, they're talking about, you know, how it works. They're talking about things like the attention to detail and a number of the different points that Brian was talking about. You know, what is the fit and finish of the product? And, you know, when somebody thinks about your product, the design really enables all of the interactions that take place. Whether it's a good design or a bad design, you know, your system is designed, whether it's an engineer who did it or whether it was someone who is a UX professional. And that's actually one of the things that I love about the team that we've built. And there are a couple of leaders in the cyberspace where, you know, I'm a computer engineer by trade and work very closely with our design team to make sure that we're thinking about these core elements, which we'll get into a little bit more in just a couple minutes. But if your software is complex, if it's complicated, if it's inconsistent, if it's confusing, that's what people are going to remember. If even the pros can't figure out your product, it doesn't matter how smart or sophisticated the algorithm behind it is, because humans can't use it. So I think very much the experience matters, user experience matters. It's what makes it possible for people to use the software. And as I said, it's what they'll remember. But more than that, there are business implications here too. So a strong user experience is why they'll choose your software over the software offered by a competitor. It's why they'll continue to use your product, and it's why they'll refer you to other customers. So it's easy to talk about design and user experience as sort of a nice to have, but I think they are the difference maker and a fundamental part of competitive business strategy when you're looking at a cybersecurity platform or piece of software.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, these days, you know, everyone's a consumer too, and consumers are so fickle about that design. I mean, look at the difference of like TikTok versus Vine. I was mentioning that in the last meeting. Vine was TikTok years ago, but they didn't have a great algorithm. AI hadn't progressed as much, and now it's the #1 app in the world.
That's right.
And that user experience of the algorithm itself is so good.
That's right. And I think you're exactly right that customer expectations are set by experiences they have as consumers themselves. And just sort of the value that you can derive from user experience and that focus on UX, Lyft versus Uber. Uber prioritized driver experience. They prioritized the user experience of their drivers. And they were down and out in 2017, but they are back now because they prioritized it in a way that Lyft didn't. And that those consumer companies are leading the way and setting expectations that carry through to business software, cyber software.
Yeah, I can't wait to start talking about the GUIs itself. Just one last quick poll here. I'm curious, just to kind of like set all our expectations. How many of you feel that your user experience could improve on your software, and maybe your software is difficult to use? If you could answer that one quickly, we'll give it 20 seconds. All right, Kim, what do we have there?
Yep. I think a couple more coming in. All right. That's good. Share the results there.
That's exactly right. It could always be better, but we were actually thinking we were going to get so many people like, oh no, our software's wonderful. But Ben, you had a funny comment about that, depending on which way the results were to go.
Yeah, well, I think like, we do sometimes hear, no, it's great. And, occasionally it's true, but usually it's just because you're not talking to your users. And I think that that's one of the first recommendations that we have is that, user research, talking to the humans who will use your software is incredibly important because they will find ways to use and break and misunderstand your software in ways that you didn't consider. So if you talk to users, if you talk to humans and do the research, it makes a huge difference in terms of setting the direction. When we build software, or when most people build software, it's easy to imagine that everyone thinks like you do. And it's easy to imagine that you understand the problem space. And it is hugely important to have a vision for what your product should be and what difference you can bring and what problem you can solve. But people are creative. They will find new ways to use your product. They will find new problems to use your algorithm to solve. And so it's important to talk to those customers. We really prioritize sitting down, doing stakeholder interviews with our customers, but their customers' customers as well. So understanding both sides of that. What does the business enable? What does the technology enable? What does the business need to succeed? But also, what do users desire? What do they want? What are the problems that they're trying to solve? And what are sort of the other products that they're using in the space? So this might sound like business strategy, but it's a fundamental underpinning of design strategy as well, and customizing and tailoring that user experience by understanding the users who will use the software. So user research and prioritizing that, whether it's called UX research or there are a number of different terms that can be used for it, but user research in general is a fundamental step in the process that people will skip because they think they know their customer or they've been the customer before. But it only takes a few interviews to really radically change your understanding of the problem space and the people who will be using your software. So it's something that we always recommend be included in a product design process.
Yeah, the reason I actually thought everybody was going to say our software's all right is because even when customers come to us to build their software, Ben's point, they think they know exactly what the feature set should be. And I remember a past client, Wendy's, we built their mobile app, and they came to us and they heard that we were, the best in making mobile apps, so they wanted to work with us. They're based out of Columbus, Ohio. And the first thing that they did was tell us all the functionality that should go into the application. And, we said, guys, you're kind of big, like, you have a wide demographic of users, you have high net worth, you have lower socioeconomic, you have urban, you have rural. Are you really sure they all want this feature? And at the time, they thought they were going to go after corporate America and sell basically that you could go to all your colleagues, take all their orders under one account, pay for it, and then have different bags, right? And trade totals is what their system did. And we were kind of looking around the room, and never once had we thought like, hey guys, someone's going to Wendy's, let's get Wendy's for lunch. Like, it just didn't really enter in that corporate workspace. It does certainly, you know, on the blue collar side, you know, a lot of times they're, you know, they don't have as long lunch breaks. They can't eat as they do knowledge work. And so they might be going to Wendy's. We said, listen, let's test everybody. So we tested urban, rural, lower, upper socioeconomic. We actually sat in the Wendy's as customers came up. We asked them if we could talk to them. We showed them some different functionality for applications. We basically polled their users, and across the board, they wanted the same three things. They didn't want to have to pay in cash or credit card, right? They wanted to have digital means of paying. And obviously you see that all over the place now. This was, you know, a handful of years ago. They didn't like waiting in lines. And nobody likes waiting in lines if they don't have to. And then the last thing is they want to be able to order whatever they could. At the time, Wendy's was strictly by number, the number 3 to number 2, whereas Chipotle was, hey, whatever you want on a sandwich, just give it to us. And they were taking off. And so we helped them redesign their app based on what the users want. And if you notice Wendy's now, there's been a huge resurgence. And they're one of the most popular fast food chains. But the brand was kind of dying out a little bit until they really analyzed their users, figured out what they wanted, what the market wanted. And then they went through and redesigned all their stores, their kiosks, their websites, their mobile applications with our help. So yeah, definitely a great example of doing user research. Brian, what do you have anything on the user experience side as a cybersecurity professional? Do you wish that people were getting, you know, asking you about features? When you see that little like pop up that says, how are we doing? Do you fill out that feedback form? I always get annoyed by them on my mobile app, but now that I think about it, I should take the time.
I always take the time to fill out those feedback forms. Maybe not necessarily cybersecurity related, but I think a great example is, you know, going through the airport after you go through TSA, they always have those little kiosks there to push the smiley face or the frowny face. And even something simple like that in your software can give you ideas as to where to focus. Your software might be pretty large, and you sit down and you try and talk to me about what can you improve. You can't ask broad questions like that when your software is ginormous, especially to somebody like myself who's a fairly busy security professional. We need to stay focused. And so figuring out what are the key areas of value to do that user research on in your application is critical. And start small. You don't have to do the whole thing at once. Focus on a core area, get feedback, iterate on it, and move on from there. I think the other side that I always tell my engineers as they're working on things is close your eyes and try and use your application. If you can navigate through the forms without looking at them, that's a clear sign that you know too much about your application and you're not taking into account the fresh user perspective of trying to figure out what fields are required, where do I go for this? If it's muscle memory for you to fill out, you're never going to catch the fact that the user experience is wrong.
No, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, the most simple form of that is thumbs up and thumbs down. Like, who would have thought how powerful that was? But the more thumbs up, the more users look at that content, and the more it's kind of that, you know, that force multiplier that makes that content, in this case, or that application, that experience takes off. So I get it. User experience, it's super powerful. I think
if I can, Todd, just
yeah.
Before we move on, you made a really good point about learning things that aren't needed. And so I do just want to share, like, user research can prevent you from wasting money developing features that users don't want. Like, there was a company that we were looking at, and they thought, you know, the CIDR block is the most important piece of information that our users will want, and they had to figure out how to get it from over here to over here so that they could present it to the customer. Customers didn't care, the users didn't care, and they almost wasted 2 sprints worth of effort going down the wrong path for a feature that wasn't valuable. So just like, again, we're talking about business, but we're talking about design and user experience, but these things solve business problems and they actually impact the success of the business. And I think that's really important to remember.
You bet. We'll have to do a follow-up on the whole agile software process too, which allows for consistent testing and change every sprint, which is generally every 2 weeks. You can keep pivoting the direction of the software. I think, just is on a soapbox too, I think government is still doing a lot of waterfall process where they're building a behemoth over months or a year, and then finally just putting it in production, starting using, getting that feedback. And its feedback loop is still months to years, not weeks. So anyway, we could definitely talk about that feedback loop and getting that research, not just up front, but throughout the application for a while. There's, as far as, user experience, like I know we also talked about, of the 5 critical components, the accessibility of it. More and more times we see the examples of like Target, unfortunately in Walmart with the ADA going after them, because you can't, originally years ago, you couldn't shop as readily as a disabled user. So they need to make sure they have screen reader access, right? But, other than, the things that make the news, how is accessibility, really important from a software perspective?
Yeah, I can jump in first.
Brian,
as a user.
Yeah, please.
So I think what's important to keep in mind is that in the United States, 1 in 4 people have some form of disability, just over roughly 26%. If your security team has 4 people on it, that means statistically, at least one of them has some sort of potential issue using your software. And we think about the stereotypical hacker scenes or cybersecurity scenes where it's just logs flowing across the page. And you don't consider, maybe you and I, that could have impacts on people with disabilities who need accommodations to be able to read that either slower, or the colors don't match because we have lacking contrast. And so as we look at trying to broaden our industry and appeal the software that we build at MindGrub for cybersecurity companies to all of the world out there for our customers, making sure that it's accessible to everybody is something that is critical, that we build into the experience. And it's not something that can come after the fact. It starts at square one because of the large majority of people out there who have some form of disability. And we do that with our dedicated testing team, who are experts in that field, who know how to use that software. It's not just, can I adjust color contrast or is the font size right? It's about motion on the screen. It's about being able to interact, and what if you can only interact one-handed? Take the accessibility side out of it. Cybersecurity is an industry that never sleeps. If you get an alert in the middle of the night where you're woken up, do you want something complicated where you have to push a bunch of buttons and respond quickly? Or do you need an interface that requires minimal interaction, presents content easily in a way that's very readable, that is accessible to everybody?
Yeah, I think the cybersecurity industry is responsible for dark mode. You see that in a lot of applications now. They have the light mode and dark mode. I think that's all those, red teams and blue teams in the basements, where they don't want that light because it's in the middle of the night. But I was also amazed, from accessibility, like how many people have color blindness, and just different color combinations can actually show as the same color or with very little contrast. So accessibility, you think of it, as I mentioned, was screen readers, but it's as simple as just the colors used and the contrast between one color and the other, like text and background. Ben, when your team designs the application, how do they really, consider accessibility, going into it?
Yeah. So we have a number of different tests that we do. Exactly like you were talking about, Todd. We think about contrast. These are so just as some sort of foundation for this. Like, we all perceive the world differently, and I think Brian made a great point about some of the specific cases. But like these, the issues that we talk about when we're talking about accessibility, they range from cognition and understanding to interaction. And there is a tremendous amount of scientific research behind these things. So it's not just a designer saying these colors look good together. We have contrast ratios that we are checking. The field of human-computer interaction has target sizes that are easy for humans to touch, and distances between buttons to ensure that you don't accidentally click delete when you mean to click save. There are There are actual guidelines that we follow that are put out. WCAG is one of them. ADA has a number of guidelines as well, and depending on the specific platform that we're on, there are a number of human interface guidelines as well. But we will make sure that we're thinking about all of those things. And I really think that these decisions about accessibility make it easier for all humans to use the software, because we're thinking about what are the ways in which things might go wrong? What are the ways in which this might be difficult for someone to use or understand what we're trying to communicate? And there is a lot of information overload here. So, we need to be thoughtful about how do we provide clarity? How do we provide clear boundaries between things? And that benefits the needs of accessibility of users who need those accommodations, but it also benefits the software product as a whole. So as I said, we have a number of checklists that we use. We have a number of organizations that have done actual scientific research that we then incorporate into the design of applications.
And I have never told you this before, but I don't know if I can keep from laughing when I tell you. As you know, I used to be an educator and I worked in instructional technology. And I had a client show me some software they had created that was learning, right? You had to learn about their products. But in designing that training experience, they thought they could gamify it a little and make it fun if they always made the next and previous buttons in a different location and they hit them. So like you would go through this thing trying to find just like that.
Oh, we're
you
losing.
have no idea what you read. How would you say that intentionality is really important? I believe that's your third major focus area for user experience.
Yeah, I think that this is one that is often overlooked. So intentionality is about making sure. So you do the user research, great. You understand the problem space that you're trying to solve. You think about accessibility, great. You've got some guidelines, but how can you be intentional about enabling your users to solve the problems that your software is designed for? So I think we haven't talked about that example before, but navigation is a critical element. How do I get to the place that I need to be from where I am now? I've gone through your training. I understand what your software does, but I don't have it memorized. Maybe I don't use it every day. So how do I achieve my goal? And so we can enable that by thinking about navigation design, those paths, those journeys. It's not just the primary navigation, it's things like secondary navigation where there's actually like courtesy navigation. So you might have the header or the bar along the side, but when I'm looking at a record, sometimes there is tangential information that I want to look at. Sometimes it makes sense to add a path to navigate. And, we were talking about CIDR blocks and maybe network analysis previously. Sometimes I will want to sort my results by clicking on that thing. Sometimes that will get in the way. And by designing with intentionality, we can think about how people will use the software and making sure that we are doing that. Software is a lot about meeting the needs of your users. And so one of our customers is Dragos, and we worked with them and built their marketing website actually. And we did a lot to understand the personas, the users of that software and the site, and the arguments we needed to make to help someone understand. And thinking about the mental model where someone was as they went through made a huge difference in the decisions that we made. And just would encourage you to check out Dragos's website and look at that navigation at the top. We were really intentional about how we segmented things, how we spoke to the different audiences, how there are a couple different ways sometimes to get to the useful information. Intentionality is also about simplicity. Sometimes the right answer is about doing less. A lot of applications, I said at the beginning, I'm a computer engineer. A lot of applications end up being designed by engineers who, throw in all the functionality and, don't necessarily think about the end user. So how do you simplify it? How do you make it easy to understand what I'm looking at and what I can do with that screen. Some of you may be familiar with the example of the nuclear attack alert that went out in Hawaii a number of years ago, and there were images of that went around social media. It wasn't clear what you were doing or why, and if you were running a test and simulating versus sending a real warning to everyone's cell phone about an imminent nuclear attack, it looked the same. So thinking about simplicity and intentionality, making it very clear what's happening and what you're doing is incredibly important. Last thing I want to talk about here is just a sense of customization. This is something that we sometimes recommend and sometimes don't recommend, and it really depends on your specific scenario. But sometimes it's valuable for someone to be able to sort of customize their own dashboard, collect the things that matter to them, or to enable or disable certain features within the platform based on their own specific network configuration or software configuration. And so I do just want to include in intentionality, sometimes it is about giving people options to customize, but usually that's maybe 3 or 4 or 5 things they can customize, not a 500 checkbox list of different options you can turn on and off, which becomes overwhelming that nobody uses it, or people use it and then they don't remember why it's behaving that way because 500 checkboxes is too many. So again, just encourage intentionality in the design of your software so that you can understand it and your users can understand it and what they're doing with it.
I like that you use the word, customization versus personalization. And I just now thought of the real distinction, because customization is allowing the end user the control, right? And that's like classic sense settings. Like if you have to send communications to a user, whether it's, email, text, or even like phone potentially, users want to tell you what their best communication channel is. They don't want you blasting on all of them, or they might block them all and then you can't get them on any channel. Personalization is where you use algorithms and you use data to know who the user is, and then to send them information you think is most important to them, which is very helpful from a marketing perspective and websites. But why wouldn't you want to do that from a software perspective, Ben?
Yeah, so software, especially in these scenarios, I think Brian made a great point about it earlier. You might wake up in the middle of the night, have to deal with the situation. The last thing you want to do is sort of find the next button. And personalization changes the interface when you're not asking for it. And sometimes we will recommend sort of adaptive or sort of adaptive algorithms or recommendation systems as part of an interface, but you put them in a consistent place and you label them appropriately so that a user knows what they're expecting. But we don't want to try to predict and change something on you at a critical moment by trying to personalize and be smart or too clever about the interface.
With the one exception, I know we nailed that with WI's app, where when there was a storm and a user opened the mobile app, we didn't want to actually tax all the servers by them trying to pay their bills at the same time, because they need those servers to help put out the storm. So in that situation, we did force storm surge mode, right? Brian, you remember that? Can you tell us a bit about the storm surge mode and why in that case we would? Because I think from a security professional on the back end and having to manage the database, that would be beneficial to the business.
Yeah, most certainly. So, in this example, when you think about having a natural disaster hit a particular area and everybody's checking to see when their power is going to be back on, or people are just looking at the outage maps, and you have, in many cases, national media attention, so you have a lot more traffic hitting your systems than normal. There is an aspect to overriding that and kind of protecting your critical systems by forcing people into the workflows that you need. I think, in a security and cybersecurity focused system, we have to strike the fine line between getting people the information as they need it and elevating what is personalized to them in that moment, versus also giving them the customizability to see what they want when they want. So I think the worst thing would be to have something that personalizes in the wrong way, such that an alert that is actually critical gets missed or fires incorrectly. I'm sure plenty of people have had false positive alerts go off. And if you have too many false positive alerts, then you you no longer pay attention to them. You just ignore them when you add email rules. If you think about the marketing emails you get, and every day Omaha Steaks sends you a marketing email at 11 a.m., like, it's great to set your clock to, but it's not helpful in terms of knowing to look at the email to see something actionable. And so you have to be really, really smart with personalization and consider all the different aspects of it.
Yeah, that's like the kid who cried wolf, right? Cries wolf so
Yep.
many times when there's actually a wolf, nobody pays attention to them. Maybe the reverse of that. You send them too many notifications and you don't prioritize the priority ones, then they won't register. Yeah, Kim.
I just want to make sure you saw, there's a question from that was sent to all the panelists. So just want to make sure that you guys saw it. The difference between the needs of federal users versus commercial. The persona tends to be different. And if you've got ideas for how to make one design work for both, I'd love to know. VP of Product from Threat Connect.
Yeah, I can
Absolutely.
start.
Yeah, please, Ben.
So I think first is to realize how broad those two audiences are, right? So there are lots of different federal users and lots of different commercial users. And so I think, one interface that serves everybody is absolutely possible, but I think it will definitely depend on sort of the specific niche that you're in. And so I think it's hard to give a one size fits all answer to that. And that's, again, why I would say user research is really important. But I would definitely say there are fundamentals of user design and interface design that will apply to both. So those rules of accessibility that we talked about, the last two recommendations that we have as well, things like visualization and scalability also sort of tie into this. So we can speak a little bit more to that, but I don't know, Todd, just in terms of federal versus commercial users, I don't know if you have any other specific thoughts on.
Well, yeah, the one difference is that sometimes the federal users have like stat users. Like, for instance, for those of you that have facilities clearance, the portal you have to use, like, is the worst piece of software I've ever used. That has probably been in it's probably, I don't know, I wouldn't even say, what would that be, like COBOL or Python, or probably old school Python, 20 years old from 94 when the internet was invented, right? But if you want to work in government contracting, you have no choice to choose that software. So they have a super captive audience. That said, shame on them. They should absolutely redesign that software, because think of how many war fighters, cyber warriors are being slowed down because that user experience is so awful, and how many companies probably would even want to go work with the government if it wasn't such a barrier to entry to use that software. I mean, it's, Brian, am I right or am I right? It's bad. Anyway, yeah, so I see federal government has a captive audience. So, obviously, like, maybe you don't have to try as hard because you're not going to lose users, but I'm telling you, you really do need to try hard, because there is disruption in every market all the time. Federal government might be a little slower than others as far as that disruption cycle. All right, great. Yeah, Ben, you had mentioned two other areas, that smart use of visualization. I know from experience how powerful this is with, with our client Dark Web ID and ID Agent. They came to us where they were drinking from the fire hose of, username and passwords that had been compromised, and they were found on the dark web. And it was simply just trolling the dark web, pulling any compromised username and passwords, and then creating an API, right? And they had a list. Like a lot of cyber software, it starts out with a search and results. That is literally the MVP of most cyber software. But then from those results, right, like, we added so much functionality. So what we ended up doing was adding a whole dashboard on top of it, and seeing one of the most powerful things is change over time, right? So that list is just a snapshot. But if you can see one of those or multiple of those data points over time, that all of a sudden adds a whole nother dimension to your software that I think is really powerful. What else around visualization, can just add that other kind of dimension to how you interact with that software?
Yeah, we hadn't talked about this beforehand, but I love that perspective of dimensionality to the data. So, there is a tremendous amount of data that flows through these systems and cybersecurity software in general, and finding the needle in a haystack is important, but also, identifying the areas that are worth investigating, even if you don't know where the specific action took place, even if you need to know generally where to look. A visual is a very quick way to get there. And so we talk sometimes about visualizations as a way to bring meaning to data. And so, we're all familiar with one or two levels of data visualization. If you've ever built a pie chart in Excel, that's the first level of like data viz. But there are much more sophisticated techniques. And depending on the problem that you're trying to solve, sometimes it's just color or size or bolding text that will help something stand out. We also have probably about 1,000 different visualization techniques that we use depending on what you're trying to pull out of the data, what's important to highlight or understand, whether they're things like tree maps or Sankey diagrams or other types of visualizations. And I also think one of the coolest things that we get to do is sometimes over time get to see how things progress. So those visualizations, if you can explore one of the dimensions and you can sort of move through time and see how things change, if you can plot that on a space, it makes it very easy for an operator to be able to figure out where should they put attention. I'll also say one of the products that we've worked on in the greater cybersecurity space is the TAC platform from the Army Futures Command. It's an open source product that many of you are probably familiar with. It's used all over the world. And we've built a number of modules there that help visualization. And visualization can sometimes mean, putting things on a map as well. So how do you see things in physical space? How do you understand where activity is? So sometimes it means sort of coalescing data points, making larger points on a map and helping to see over time how things are moving or unfolding in the physical world. So visualization can take a number of different forms, but we are, like humans, are hardwired to explore the world around them through visual means, and visualizations are a great way to do that. And we talked about accessibility earlier. I will say that there are lots of accessible ways to do this as well. We talk about visualization, but even for non-sighted users, there are ways that we can sort of condense information or surface it in a way that is accessible to those users as well.
Great. Yeah, thank you very much. Moving into the last question here, because I said we'd seen. Moving to the last question. Any further questions, please do put them in the chat at this time so that we can roll into any final questions before we adjourn. But the last question, Brian, I'm going to throw it over to you because we talked about that fifth key element being scalability. How important is that in software design, and how is it done?
Yeah, totally. And as an engineer, probably one of the most important pieces to me as we bridge the gap between the user experience and design side of things and the technical side of things. Cybersecurity is everyone's problem. Yes, it's Nike's problem. We talked about that at the start and how they're indirectly a cybersecurity company, but so is the farmers market lemonade stand that's happening under the Jones Falls during the summer in Baltimore, where somebody's there taking payments and selling lemonade. And so having your software be able to accommodate both the few users and the large users is critical, and being able to scale that. And that comes in a lot of different ways. It's not just an engineering challenge. Certainly more data means more computation, means more interesting ways to display. We get into visualizations a lot more. It's easy to read a log file with 10 log entries in it for the day. It's a lot harder to read a log file and pull out what's needed with 10,000 log entries in it for the day, or 100,000 or 10 million log entries or more. And so having your software be able to present what's needed to the users who are on the smaller side is great. Having it also be able to scale with them and grow and have it be something that keeps with them is a way to keep a customer and a way to keep them happy and keep them familiar with what you're using.
Oh, Todd, I think we've lost your audio. While you try to troubleshoot that, I'll share as well that I think this in some ways could apply to the question about federal versus commercial customers as well. In terms of scalability, it's clients of different sizes, it's different technology stacks and platforms that you're running on or operating with, but it's also different types of users. And so, there are larger institutional buyers that will have certain needs and expectations of your product, and there are smaller, more individual market sort of buyers who may be purchasing your software. And especially for those larger institutional or government buyers, what is the reporting that a CISO needs versus an operator? What are the interfaces that they need to be able to see through your software? So that scalability is also just the multiple ways that your product will be used, and thinking about those different personas within the single buyer's environment. Who needs to use it, and how do you scale to the needs of someone who uses it occasionally or on a daily basis? And this is something we thought about. We have a customer in the emergency response 911 call handling space, working on next generation 911. And we thought about, how do you design an interface for someone who's a call taker on a daily basis? And how do you serve the needs of the mayor during an emergency, answering calls there as additional support? And how do you make sure that it scales to someone who doesn't have training, but needs to use the system on a regular basis? And it is absolutely possible. It just takes work and, as we said earlier, intentionality to achieve.
Yeah, I think part of that even, yeah, great. And on that federal and commercial front, you think about the smaller users or people who aren't as large. They might not have a security operations center running that they need to feed your software into to report. Your software might be the only thing that they have, but as it grows and as it scales, they're going to want to integrate it with something else to do that reporting. And so not just pigeonholing yourself into the larger size or the smaller size, but really scaling with your customers as they grow with the different user types is critical.
All right. So this is a perfect, Kim just emailed us a question. To finish up, I'll give you guys a chance to answer one or two questions or both to kind of wrap here. The first question being, is there anything that we didn't have on the list, right? We talked about user research, intentionality, smart use of visualization, scalability, and accessibility. If you could add a sixth thing to that, what would it be? And then the user question that they asked was a good one. It's, how would you know if your software does all 5 parts? Which obviously we've got a number of tools that we implement to do that too. But so what's the sixth thing? And what are some of the ways that we can know if your software has all 5, now 6 parts? Ben?
Yeah, so I think, developing a comprehensive product strategy is actually fundamental to design as well. You can't design for a system that you don't understand. And so thinking about the long-term roadmap and making sure that you're thinking about, informed by user research, informed by intentionality, and all of that, but like making sure that you understand your user needs, but also the functional requirements. That's the underpinning of a strategy, and it really is the thing upon which all design is going to rest. And so, I could list 10 more things about the visual aesthetic and the structure and the function of the application, and those are things that designers will know to focus on. But I'm trying to think about the things that are often overlooked and the things that we really encourage our team to focus on, and that foundational strategy, the partnership between a UX designer and a product manager or a product owner, really is, I think, foundational and fundamental to building quality experience.
That's a good one. So looking at that heuristic product operation, as far as like, how do you know if your software has all 5 of those? Do you have the litmus test, so to speak?
Yeah, it actually might go back to the first thing. So first of all, you will know if you've done the user research. So have you talked to users? Get out there. I encourage you to do it, or to hire a firm who can conduct that user research. You don't need to survey 5,000 people, but talk to some people who are actually using your software, and they'll tell you. Like, they will let you know if it's confusing or hard to navigate, and then you can decide, is that a design problem or is it a training problem? Because there are some problems that are just hard to solve. Are you using visualization? That is a question. You can take a look at your application and are you visualizing? Now, are you doing it in a smart way or the best way? I think I would recommend talking to someone who's an expert in it to understand that. But, just the checkbox of whether you're doing it or not, that's something you can answer for yourself. In terms of scalability, again, this comes back to user research. Are you able to serve the needs of the executive sponsor who needs the dashboard reporting and the operator? Those are things that you can take a look at. You'll learn from user feedback, and you can also look at your sales sheet to tell you, is it scalable? Are you targeting? Are you able to serve all the clients that you're targeting and your sales team is targeting? Accessibility is a little bit harder to self-assess. It's something that we actually offer an assessment service where we can take a look and provide some recommendations. I will say, even though there's a lot of scientific research and a lot of guidance in the accessibility space, and there are formal guidelines, there's still a lot of subjectivity in terms of assessing that. So I wouldn't recommend, just downloading the list and checking for yourself, because there are things that you learn as standard patterns for enabling this an accessible design. So number one answer comes back to first talk to your users. If you are doing the user research, if you are listening to your users, that is giving you a huge leg up on product design. Especially, you got to do something with it once you ask them. But if you are doing that, the rest can fall in place if you're a responsive organization.
Yeah, that goes back to what we did for Wendy's, right? Like, take those 5 questions, turn them into, or take those, 5 areas, turn them into a series of assessment questions, and get in front of your users across all their personas. So in the case, back with Wendy's, it was the urban versus the rural, right? Different socioeconomic levels, because they were all sorts. Know your user, test your user across those elements, and then take that feedback to know where you have to do any design updates, user experience updates, or maybe even, technology updates. Brian, if you could add a 6th final thing to, get on the hit list of what's really important, what would you add?
Yeah, my 6 kind of falls under the same product strategy umbrella, but I have phrased it a little differently and took a little different approach on it from my side, which is, don't feel like you have to follow the trend. Think back 10 years ago. Everybody wanted to be Facebook in a different way. And of all those companies, very few of them actually succeeded. We look at the security and cybersecurity industry, we have a lot of long-standing pieces of software in there. Some of them do great things. I remember my early days of working with Nagios for monitoring and alerting. And I think the Nagios interface is still very similar to what it was back then. So talk to your users, figure out what they're using now, understand why they're using it, but don't just copy software, what their software does, because you think that's what the market is following. Just because somebody's a market leader today doesn't mean they're going to be a market leader tomorrow, and doesn't mean that their implementation is any good. And if you kind of going back to what Ben said of talking to people, you'll find this out as you talk to people as well, and you compare your software to others, or even just talk to them about what they're using. It doesn't have to be very formal. We have RSA coming up. There are plenty of other industry events that are much smaller and much more local, where find a person or two, chat with them, and just get their take and have a down-to-earth conversation about what's working and what's not working, and make sure you have reason and intentionality for why you're copying something from another piece of software if you believe it's important for your software.
Great. Well, Brian, Ben, thank you guys for sharing. We're almost at the end of time here. If there's any last questions, please put in the chat. But otherwise, you guys have any parting words before we do officially adjourn here?
Yeah, so I want to go back to sort of the point that I made at the beginning, which is design it's more than just how something looks, and that's a big part of it, but it's about how it works. And so design is something that solves business problems. And I think having an engineering team, having a product team that appreciates and incorporates designs, it's a difference maker. It's why people will choose your software. It's why they'll recommend it to their colleagues. It's why they'll stick with it when they're using it. And if you're pursuing a piece of software that has real business value, you owe it to yourself to invest in the design because it's going to be a force multiplier.
Yeah, I agree. I think engineers will be your best friends in developing software in terms of telling you what they need. They'll be your worst enemy in telling you how it should work. Todd made the great point earlier. Cybersecurity professionals are the reason dark mode exists. And that might not be great from an accessibility standpoint for some people. So talk to your designers. It's not just colors. It's about how software works, and it will make everybody's lives better.
Great.
It actually does work very well also for museums when you're using it as navigation. So that's the other use case. Anywhere you don't want light. So, well, thank you, gentlemen. Kim, thank you for putting this together. And for those of you that are going to RSA in 2 weeks now, please reach out. Come to the luncheon that we have at the Giant Stadium on Tuesday. Kim can give you the details. We'd love to talk to you further about the user experience and product design.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Thank you.